In 1980, a studio technician at Electric Lady Studios in New York noticed something that made him question his own perception. The man who walked into the studio at 2 in the afternoon was quiet, almost withdrawn, moving through the space like he was trying not to be noticed. He set up his Gibson Les Paul with meticulous precision, adjusted the Marshall amp settings with barely a word to anyone, and recorded his guitar parts with technical perfection, but zero emotional presence. 8 hours later, that same man walked onto the stage at Madison Square Garden and transformed into a completely different human being. The energy, the charisma, the dangerous electricity that radiated from Ace Frehley under those stage lights seemed impossible to reconcile with the ghost who had inhabited the studio that afternoon. The technician mentioned it to a colleague, half joking. "Are we sure that's the same guy?" But the question lingered, unanswered and unsettling. Because the more people paid attention, the more they realized that Ace Frehley wasn't just playing a character on stage. He was becoming someone else entirely. And the man in the studio wasn't pretending to be subdued. That was a different person, too. Throughout Kiss's golden era from 1975 to 1982, dozens of producers, engineers, and session musicians worked with Ace Frehley in recording environments. Almost universally, they described the same experience: a talented but deeply introverted guitarist who seemed uncomfortable in the studio setting, who needed multiple takes not because he lacked skill, but because he seemed disconnected from the material, who rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and even then in brief, almost reluctant sentences. Bob Ezrin, who produced the Destroyer album in 1976, later recalled that getting Ace engaged during studio sessions was like pulling teeth from a man who would rather be anywhere else. The guitar parts were technically proficient, sometimes brilliant, but they felt emotionally flat, as if Ace was going through motions rather than expressing something authentic. Yet those same producers and engineers would occasionally attend Kiss concerts and witness a transformation that defied logical explanation. The withdrawn, almost painfully shy musician they'd worked with in the controlled environment of a recording studio became an explosive force of nature on stage. Ace's guitar playing in live settings had a raw, improvisational quality that never appeared on studio recordings. His stage presence radiated confidence and danger. He connected with audiences in ways that seemed impossible for someone with his studio personality. It was as if the act of stepping onto a stage flipped some internal switch that changed not just his behavior, but his fundamental nature. If you've ever felt like you're a different person in different environments, if you've experienced the strange sensation of not recognizing yourself in certain situations, then you'll understand the psychological complexity of what was happening inside Ace Frehley. Before we explore the full depth of this phenomenon and what it reveals about identity, performance, and the cost of fame, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. The evidence we're about to present will challenge everything you thought you knew about the man behind the Space Ace makeup. The recording of the Love Gun album in early 1977 provided some of the most documented examples of Ace's studio personality. Eddie Kramer, the legendary producer who had worked with Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, found himself frustrated by Ace's approach to recording his guitar solos. In live performance, Ace's solos were known for their spontaneous energy and emotional intensity. But in the studio, he seemed to shut down creatively. Kramer would set up multiple microphones, get the perfect amp tone, and then watch as Ace methodically played technically correct but emotionally empty takes. When Kramer pushed him to be more expressive, to capture some of that stage energy, Ace would simply nod and play another take that was virtually identical to the previous one. What made this particularly puzzling was that Ace clearly possessed the ability to play with feeling and spontaneity. His work on the live album Kiss Alive, recorded in 1975, demonstrated exactly the kind of passionate, dynamic guitar playing that seemed to evaporate in studio settings. The difference couldn't be explained by skill or knowledge. It was something deeper, something psychological. Ace in the studio appeared to be operating from a completely different part of his personality, one that prioritized control and precision over expression and risk. Session musicians who worked alongside Ace during various recording projects noticed other behavioral patterns that reinforced the sense of dealing with two distinct personalities. Studio Ace arrived exactly on time, never early, never late. He set up his equipment in the same systematic way every session. He took breaks at predictable intervals, usually smoking cigarettes alone rather than socializing with other musicians. He listened to playbacks with an analytical detachment, noting technical issues but rarely commenting on the emotional or artistic qualities of the music. One session guitarist who worked on some overdubs for the Dynasty album later described the experience as working with a very skilled robot who happened to look like Ace Frehley. The contrast with Ace's stage persona was so extreme that crew members who worked with Kiss on tour developed their own theories to explain the transformation. Some attributed it to alcohol and drugs, suggesting that Ace needed substances to access his performance personality. While there was certainly truth to Ace's struggles with addiction, the personality split appeared long before his substance use became problematic and persisted even during periods when he was relatively sober. The chemical explanation was too simple for a phenomenon that seemed rooted in something more fundamental about Ace's psychological makeup. What happened when Ace stepped onto a stage went beyond normal performer adrenaline or the expected difference between rehearsal and live show energy. Crew members described watching his body language change as he walked from the backstage area toward the stage entrance. The hunched, protective posture he maintained in private spaces would gradually straighten. His gait would change from shuffling and uncertain to confident and purposeful. By the time the stage lights hit him and the crowd noise washed over him, Ace Frehley had become Space Ace, but it was more than just slipping into character. The transformation involved a complete reorganization of his personality structure, accessing parts of himself that remained completely unavailable in other contexts. Musicians who jammed with Ace in informal settings noticed that he occupied a middle ground between his studio and stage personalities. In relaxed environments like backstage warm-ups or hotel room jam sessions, Ace could be playful and creative with his guitar work, showing flashes of the spontaneity that defined his live performances. But he still maintained a certain guardedness, a protective shell that only fully dissolved under the specific conditions of being on stage in front of an audience. The audience seemed to be the key variable, the necessary element that allowed Ace to access his full expressive range. In 1981, during one of the more tumultuous periods of Kiss's history, the band's management arranged for members to speak with a psychologist who specialized in performance anxiety and creative blocks. The sessions were meant to address growing tensions within the band, but Ace's individual session revealed something unexpected. The psychologist, Dr. Marion Friedman, later wrote a paper for a professional journal, changing names and identifying details, but describing a case that many in the music industry recognized as being about Ace Frehley. The paper discussed dissociative identity patterns in performance artists, specifically focusing on a subject who exhibited what Friedman termed context-dependent personality fragmentation. According to Friedman's analysis, certain individuals develop such extreme divisions between their public and private selves that the two personas begin operating almost independently. This goes beyond normal code switching or the expected differences in behavior across social contexts. In extreme cases, the person experiences their performance self as genuinely separate, with different emotional access, different behavioral patterns, and even different cognitive processing. The studio environment, with its emphasis on technical precision, repeatability, and critical listening, activated one personality structure in ACE. The stage environment, with its emphasis on spontaneity, audience connection, and emotional expression, activated a completely different structure. What made ACE's case particularly interesting from a psychological perspective was that neither personality seemed to be the real Ace Frehley. The studio ghost and the stage demon were both authentic expressions of different parts of his psyche, but neither represented the complete person. Friends and family members who knew Ace outside of musical contexts described yet another version of his personality, one that was warmer and more relaxed than studio Ace, but less manic than stage Ace. The fragmentation meant that no single environment or context could access the full range of Ace's personality. He was perpetually divided, with different situations calling forth different fragments of his identity. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, as Kiss's commercial peak began to decline and internal tensions increased, the divide between Ace's studio and stage personalities became even more pronounced. The Unmasked album sessions in 1980 represented a particular low point for Studio Ace. Producer Vinnie Poncia, who had successfully worked with Kiss on previous albums, found himself increasingly frustrated by Ace's disconnected approach to recording. In interviews years later, Poncia described sessions where Ace would record perfectly adequate guitar parts, but with absolutely no enthusiasm or creative input. When asked for his opinion on arrangements or song direction, Ace would typically shrug and say, "Whatever you think is best," completely abdicating any artistic authority. Yet during the same period, Kiss's live shows continued to feature some of Ace's most dynamic and engaging performances. Concert footage from the Unmasked tour shows Ace fully inhabiting the Space Ace character, interacting with audiences, improvising solos that went beyond the album versions, and radiating the kind of charismatic energy that had made him a fan favorite. The disconnect between the man who couldn't muster enthusiasm for his own guitar parts in the studio and the performer who electrified audiences night after night became impossible to ignore. Sound engineers began documenting the difference in technical terms. Studio recordings of Ace's guitar work showed consistent tone, precise timing, and careful attention to staying within the arrangement structure. Live recordings from the same period showed more dynamic range in his playing, more risk-taking with timing and phrasing, and a willingness to push against the song structure in ways he never attempted in studio settings. The tonal quality of his guitar work also differed, with live performances showing more aggression and edge, while studio work remained polished but safe. It was as if two different guitarists were playing the same songs with the same equipment, but bringing completely different artistic sensibilities to the task. The fragmentation that had defined Ace's creative life throughout Kiss's peak years began to take a psychological toll as the 80s progressed. Being unable to access his full personality in any single context created a sense of never feeling completely authentic or whole. Studio work left him feeling empty and disconnected because he couldn't bring his passionate, expressive self into that environment. But stage performances, while thrilling in the moment, were equally incomplete because the analytical, thoughtful part of his personality remained locked away. The result was a pervasive sense of being fragmented, of never quite being able to integrate the different parts of himself into a coherent whole. This psychological stress contributed to Ace's increasing reliance on alcohol and drugs during this period. Substances offered a temporary bridge between his divided selves, a chemical method of accessing emotional states that should have been naturally available but weren't because of his psychological fragmentation. The numbing effect of alcohol also helped manage the anxiety that came from never feeling fully present or authentic in any situation. By 1982, when Ace officially left Kiss, his substance use had become severe enough to overshadow the underlying personality split that had contributed to his struggles in the first place. Ace's departure from Kiss in 1982 was officially attributed to creative differences and personal problems, which was true but incomplete. The deeper issue was that the structure of being in Kiss, with its rigid division between studio work and live performance, had become psychologically unsustainable for someone whose personality was already severely fragmented along those same lines. Every album cycle reinforced the split. Every tour deepened the divide. Ace couldn't continue operating as two fundamentally different people without eventually breaking down completely. Leaving Kiss was, in some ways, an act of psychological self-preservation, an attempt to escape an environment that was amplifying his internal fragmentation to dangerous levels. What happened after Ace left Kiss provides some of the most interesting evidence for the twin brother theory. Without the rigid structure of Kiss's studio versus live division, Ace began to show signs of personality integration. His first solo album after leaving Kiss, recorded in 1987 under the Frehley's Comet name, showed more emotional presence in the studio recordings than anything he'd done with Kiss. Producers working on that album noted that Ace seemed more relaxed and engaged in the studio environment, though still not to the level of his stage persona. The extreme withdrawal and disconnection that had characterized his Kiss studio years began to soften. Interestingly, some observers noted that Ace's live performances during the same period became slightly less manic and explosive than they had been during the Kiss years. It was as if removing the pressure of the Kiss structure allowed the two personality fragments to begin moving toward each other, slowly closing the gap that had defined his creative life for over a decade. The studio Ace became warmer and more present. The stage Ace became more grounded and controlled. Neither transformation was complete, and Ace continued to show different personalities in different contexts, but the extreme split began to heal. This gradual integration supports the theory that Ace's personality fragmentation was not just an inherent trait, but was being actively reinforced by the specific environment and demands of being in Kiss. The rigid separation between studio perfectionism and stage spectacle, the emphasis on maintaining consistent character roles, the pressure to subordinate individual identity to the band's collective image, all of these factors created conditions that made it difficult for someone with Ace's psychological makeup to maintain an integrated sense of self. Removing those pressures allowed some healing to occur, though the scars of that fragmentation would affect Ace's creative output for the rest of his career. Decades after leaving Kiss, Ace Frehley continued to struggle with the legacy of his personality split. Interviews and memoir accounts show a man still grappling with questions of authentic identity and the cost of having spent crucial developmental years operating as fragmented selves. The Space Ace character, which had once been a liberating alternate identity that allowed him to access parts of his personality unavailable to Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, had become a cage that reinforced unhealthy psychological patterns. Even in his 70s, Ace sometimes speaks about his stage persona in third person, as if Space Ace is still a separate entity rather than an integrated part of his complete self. The twin brother theory, while perhaps overstated in its most extreme form, points to a real and significant psychological phenomenon that affected Ace's entire career. The man in the studio and the man on stage were not literally different people, but they were different enough, accessed different enough parts of Ace's personality that they might as well have been. Understanding this split helps explain many of the apparent contradictions in Ace's creative history. The technically proficient but emotionally flat studio work coexisting with passionate live performances, the extreme introversion in private settings alongside explosive stage charisma, the sense that no one, including Ace himself, ever fully knew who he really was beneath the makeup and the mythology. For fans who grew up watching Space Ace command stages around the world, the revelation that the man behind the makeup struggled with such profound identity fragmentation adds a layer of tragedy to his story. The performer who seemed so confident and complete on stage was actually experiencing a kind of psychological fracture that would take decades to even partially heal. The cost of that amazing stage presence was a studio ghost who couldn't access his own passion, and ultimately a human being who spent years feeling incomplete in every context, never quite able to bring his full self to any single moment. The twin brother theory reminds us that the people we see on stage are rarely as simple or as integrated as they appear. Behind the makeup, beneath the persona, there are complex human beings struggling with questions of identity and authenticity that most of us never have to confront in such extreme forms. Ace Frehley's journey through personality fragmentation and toward some measure of integration is ultimately a story about the price of fame, the cost of performance, and the difficulty of maintaining a coherent sense of self when the world demands that you be different people in different contexts. The studio ghost and the stage demon were both real, both Ace and both incomplete. And understanding that incompleteness is key to understanding the man who became Space Ace and the price he paid for that transformation.